How 911 forged an age of political turmoil. The surreal twist of 911 20 years later. CNN, America went into battle on September 11, 2001, united in defense of its values and ways of life. 20 years on, it's at war with itself, each democracy threatened from within a way Osama bin Laden never managed. In the moment, the 911 attacks that came from the blue sky on a crisp, clear morning stretched the clarity in their horror and dastardly conception and proved that vast oceans could no longer shield the US from the terror of the outside world. But for a few weeks at least, everyone, liberal, conservative, no matter the race or creed, was as one in the mourning nearly 3,000 deaths and fearing more strikes. In hidden side, however, the attacks heralded the dawn of the era of political trauma and turbulence that stood snuffed out of river period when a prosperous U.S. had basked in the post-Cold War glow of peace, standing as a lone superpower. History gives the event clarity that they lacked in real time, but it cannot recall the pain, panic, and disorientation of those terrible, etching days after 911 that drove the decisions of political leaders. In retrospect, it's now clear that despite the heroism of thousands of troops killed or maimed in post-911 wars, the excesses of the U.S. political response caused as much, if not more, upheaval as the attacks themselves. September 11, 2001 doesn't explain everything, but the war on terror took the America in the political direction from which there was no coming back. A sharp, successful war in Afghanistan bogged down into a 20-year quagmire that ended only last month. Another war in Iraq, fought on false pretenses, was its own early version of the big lie. A new government security state designed to thwart follow-on attacks on endures. Trust in Washington was buckled by vast surveillance programs. America's name was soiled by torture. The judicial war on terror stretched the Constitution. President George W. Bush went from being a champion on the rubble at ground zero to the leader destroyed by his own war. His successor, Barack Obama, spent 2 terms struggling to bring the anti-terror campaign within the law and international morality, but his use of letter-drawn strikes to take out terror targets also caused civilian casualties and was condemned by human rights advocates. All the while, the thousands of deaths and injuries in foreign wars, the trillions of dollars spent on nation building, fury at Washington elite, and prejudice against Islam brewed a pool of resentment ripe for the demagogue. And along came Donald Trump vowing to ban Muslims from entering the US and boasting he was smarter than all generals who led years of draining combat. The political wounds of the post-911 years was expected yet again in recent days, as the chaotic final withdrawal from Kabul brought history full circle. The fundamentalist Taliban who welcomed Al-Qaeda ruled Afghanistan again. Bin Laden who sent suicide hijackers to steal fuel-laden jetliners and icons of U.S. political, economic, and military power believed the U.S. was corrupt, weak, and immoral. But even he wouldn't be surprised to observe the bitter internal estrangement he helped it to unleash. Was it worth it? A walk through the grassy avenues between the graves of America's post-911 war deaths in Section 60 of Arlington National Cemetery, within sight of the flight paths of the hijacked jet that screeched into the Pentagon, poses a haunting question. Was the war on terror worth the cost? Rows of white headstones, some bearing tokens like uni-badged bottles or even bottles of beer, commemorate those lost in Iraq and Afghanistan. Thousands of civilians caught in the crossfire of 2 decades of American war have no memorials in Washington. Robert Gates, the former Bush and Obama defense secretary, reflected Thursday on what had been won and lost. Nobody on September 12, 2001 would have dreamed that we would go 20 years without another major attack on the United States, Gates said at the Aspen Security Forum event. By the same token, I think that the cost of these wars in lives lost, in lives changed forever on the part of our military and many of our civilians who served and cost to the country in terms of treasure and everything else have been enormous. In the furor over the mismanaged withdrawal from Afghanistan, it was often forgotten that the first battles of the war on terror succeeded as the U.S. crossed the Al-Qaeda, though Bin Laden escaped through Tora Bora's caves. Going into Afghanistan for its stated purpose at the time made it worth it, said Obama's former Homeland Security Secretary Jay Johnson, arguing at the Bipartisan Policy Center Forum that 3 administrations had degraded Al-Qaeda's capacity to hit the U.S., while underscoring that it could never be worth it to lose a son or daughter in war. Johnson said, "It was obviously costly, very costly. We ended up in the place where the Taliban is in charge again. But a lot has happened in that 20 years period that I think have made the homeland safer." The volunteer was, but what can be said of the years long after the attacks on New York and the Pentagon and the crash of the plane believed to be heading to the U.S. Capitol brought down by passengers in Pennsylvania? With Al-Qaeda rotted, Americans were still dying in the futile effort to build a functioning Afghan state. Were their deaths in vain in the war that ended in U.S. defeat? Was their service betrayed by political leaders? Tony Brooks, who served as the Army Ranger in Afghanistan and Iraq, insisted that despite the recent U.S. exit, the sacrifices of those who served gifted freedom to the generation of Afghans, citing the case of any young girl there. She lived her life for 20 years to say it all for nothing is just discarding the children and the women of Afghanistan, in my opinion, Brooks said. Brooks, who left college and joined our after 9/11, also pointed out that the burdens of war on terror were not equally shared and said the media coverage did not fully reflect the reality of losses across the country. These wars were very unique in the fact that they were 100% volunteer, said Brooks, adding that the fighting happened in the shadows and got news coverage only when something went wrong. I don't think the troops were ever honored, to be honest, ever. Because of the all-volunteer army, it was easy to dismiss. If we were forcing people to go in, it would be a different story. President Joe Biden understood the toll inflicted on small towns and cities across America, one that undoubtedly factored into the politics of the last 20 years. How many thousands more of America's daughters and sons are you willing to risk? He asked when explaining his decision to leave Afghanistan. How long would you have them stay? Would you send your own son or daughter? If the 9/11 attacks were the failure of imagination by U.S. authorities, who would have thought the terror gang armed only with box cutters could humble a superpower? Iraq was a case of over-imagination, as political leaders shocked by the mass casualties of 9/11 flattered about what a tyrant with nuclear weapons could do. But the Bush administration's invasion was also an example of U.S. hubris, as it sought new targets after Al-Qaeda. The failure to find weapons of mass destruction, the miscalculation that U.S. troops would be greeted as liberators instead of targets for insurgents, and the malfunctioning Iran influenced the states that the U.S. left behind, dealt a devastating blow to trust in government and the credibility of the mainstream media, which was insufficiently skeptical about the war. Further, the power vacuum left in the wake of dictator Saddam Hussein's overthrow, capture, and execution spawned a terror group more ruthless than Al-Qaeda, ISIS. These were all factors that thickened the through stew of mistrust Trump later exploited. How 9/11 wars shaped the national mood. Without the disaster of Iraq, America might not yet have had its first black president. Back when he was still an Illinois state lawmaker, Obama said he was not a fascist, but opposed the dumb wars. The message originated in 2008, and his creed of hope offered relief from the Bush years when the post-9/11 wars were going bad. And if Obama had not been in the Oval Office, Trump would have lacked fewer of the backlash campaign rooted in the racist claim that the 44th president was not born in the United States. But in 2016, Trump also touched a national mood, channeling supporters who believed that the political, economic, military, and media establishment ignored a greater swath of the hurting country. Trump ran as a classic strongman, exploiting weariness with 911 words, hollowed out rural economies, and feeling that the world was taking America for the free ride. His call for total complete shutdown on Muslim immigration played on suspicion of outsiders left over from 911 and mirrored his demonization of a Mexican immigrant. It claimed that he was spied on by the Obama administration would have found less traction but for revelations about government surveillance by Edward Snowden, where Obama outlawed torture, Trump championed it. After Obama built bridges with the Muslim world, his successor complained that the US didn't steal the oil in Iraq. You have to fight fire with fire, Trump said, backing waterboarding. We have to be so strong, we have to fight so viciously and violently, because we are dealing with violent people. In retrospect, Trump's rhetoric shadows his introduction of violence into political debate, which culminated in his incitement of the mob that invaded the U.S. Capitol, inspired by his lies after election fraud. Ruth Bancroft, a New York University history professor, said that Trump fused the element of the new security state, like a top Department of Homeland Security, and the torture of terror suspects into his own brand. It hurt. It was about us. 20 years on, the emotive power of September 11th has eased, though not for the believed, and the small moments can bring memories of that day of infamy rushing back, like the green glint of an airliner flying above the city skyscrapers, or the watch showing 9:46 a.m., the time when the first plane hit the North Tower of the World Trade Center. The generation of Americans has grown up in the world that 911 made. Babies born weeks after the attacks are now college sophomores. Some of the first Americans to fight have now sent their own kids to foreign battlefield. Bush once warned on the multi-generational struggle against terrorism, but climate change and the rise of China are now seen as bigger threats, and the most acute danger from terrorists is now homegrown. Al-Qaeda may have failed to hit the Capitol, but the building was attacked by the extremists who confirmed the government warnings that the white supremacy is now the country's top terrorism threat. After 9/11, America united to defend itself. It failed to do the same when confronted by the president who mounted an assault on democracy. Divides also cleaved the country in another national crisis, the coronavirus pandemic, which kills more people every 2 days than dies on September 11, 2001. If the new 911 happens, it's difficult to believe the national and political unity forged by the first one would be repeated. Beyond the politics, and as he contemplates 911 on the 20th anniversary, Brooks, who now practices chiropractic medicine and authored a book, Leave No Man Behind, about his wartime service, lament a loss of national togetherness. That was the most unifying event in my lifetime, and since then it felt like every major event that happens in the world just divides us even more, he said. It's not the same world where the mission was greater than self. It was all about us, not me. I think right now it's about me.